Good morning, perfect English students. We have a great class today on I Believe That Books Will Never Disappear by Jorge Luis Borges. It's an interview, but it's actually interviews. This is a collection of talks and conversations that Borges had with his good friend, Alefano. And they took the major points of these talks and put them into an interview for us. They did all the hard work. Before we get into the interview, I'd like to do our pre-reading activity. What is the difference between an interview and chatting? Just talking back and forth. A big difference. Interview has a purpose. The purpose is maybe to get a job, maybe to do an interview about a person's history of poetry, history of literature, maybe a position in a school, a new job. An interview, the person that's conducting the interview has a goal, and the person that's having the interview wants to be accepted on some level. So the main thing, the difference is between chatting and an interview has a purpose, and you have to be prepared. The more prepared you are, the better the interview will go. So the second point is think of different situations where people are interviewed. For instance, you want to get into a nice school, the best school, maybe a Sai Baba school. You have to go through an interview process. Or you want to get a new job. So when you go to the employer, you want to have studied the company, studied what the position is going to entail, and how you can fulfill that position. So every situation is different, but the preparation has to take place. The more prepared you are, the better the interview will go. So let me tell you a little bit about this author, Jorge Luis Borges. He was a writer, and you can see that he lived from 1889 to 1986, almost 87 years. And he wrote mostly short stories, not long epics, but short stories that would have a meaning. He wrote essays, poems, and he translated many other works too. He was born in Buenos Aires, and his works all contain the character of unreality in literature. So he would always look for a poem or literature and try to get a higher meaning from it, the unreality, the higher reality, above and beyond just the mundane existence. That was his keynote, is he would always look for a deeper, more meaningful experience in literature. And of course, that highest experience is the God experience. And so he would write about God. He wrote about dreams. He wrote about labyrinths. We all know what a labyrinth is. It's a series of hedges, and there's only one way to get to the end. It's like a maze. Libraries, mirrors, infinity, fictional writers. He loved fictional writers. Philosophy, legal philosophy, God philosophy, higher philosophy, religion and God. That was his favorite subject, and all of his stories would get towards that final goal of knowing God. And that's what happens in this interview, as you'll see. And we'll talk more about the interviewee at the end of the interview. So the interview starts off, and Robert Alefano says to Borges, "What was your first literary reading, Borges?" So he thought back, and he said, "I believe my first reading was Grimm's fairy tales in an English version." Here he was born in South America, but he read in English. He studied English right away. "I was educated in my father's library, perhaps more than in high school or the university." It's very interesting. If you have access to a big library like his father had, you're able to explore many more things. And he admits that he learned more from his father's library than even informal schooling. So Alefano goes on, and he says, Can we talk about Donna Leora, your mother? As we talked about before, in the Spanish language, Donna is a word for miss. It's an honorary word. And so this is what Alefano calls the mother of Borges, Donna Leonora. Borges says, Borges is the English way of saying Borges. My mother was an extraordinary person. I should speak above all of her kindness towards me. I'll tell you a secret of mine. I feel somewhat guilty for not having been a happy man in order to have given her a deserved happiness. Parents are always happy when their kids are happy. And Borges was admittedly a little bit serious and sometimes not always happy. And he wanted to be happy to give her deserved happiness. I feel guilty. Perhaps I should have been more understanding of her. But I don't know. I suppose that it is true of all children that when our mother dies, we feel we have taken her for granted, as we do with the moon or the sun or the seasons. We feel we have abused her. And he makes a very valid point here. When my mother passed away, it was unexpected. And it was 2 weeks after we had a little altercation. And I feel so bad that I had that altercation with her 2 weeks before she passed. And whenever your mother passes away, you can think back, oh, she was so kind, so loving, so supportive of you. So that's why he makes this point in this interview to treat your mother as nicely as you can, because you don't have a chance to do it after she's passed away. And then he goes into the sun and the moon and the seasons. And he gets us to reflect on this. Here we have the sun every day. Every day we wake up. When it's a sunny morning, we're happy. But we take the sun for granted. And then the moon goes through its phases. We love the full moon. We like it when we see the first slice. But in a way, a lot of people take it for granted. We don't really honor and worship the moon and the sun as we can. And then he points out to the seasons. We take it for granted. There's the rainy season, the hot season. But it's nice to have this change. If it was the same weather every day, it would be a little boring and not creative. So he mentions that. And then he goes further. He says, before her death, talking about his mother, it doesn't dawn upon us. My mother was an intelligent and gracious person who I believe had no enemies. He never saw anybody being angry with his mother, which is a nice quality. So Alefano goes on. He's talked to him many times. He knows the questions to ask. He goes, Homer wrote in the Odyssey. The Odyssey is a beautiful book that a lot of people have read. And he quoted, the gods wrought and spun the skein of ruin for men, that there might be a song for those yet to be born. It was part of Homer's philosophy that the gods give humans trouble so that they can overcome the trouble and create a song to be sung in the future for people to be more inspired. So Borges says, well, it is the same idea. In one of my poems, I say that humiliation, misfortune, discord were given to us so that we may transmute them, so that we may overcome them, so that we may make of these miserable circumstances of our life eternal works, or works that aspire to be eternal. So in other words, we turn lemons into lemonade. Whatever Baba gives us, he feels, is a gift. And we should see the bright side of it and try to make it work out. And then he goes further. A verse of Goethe comes to mind. Alles nahe word fein, which means all that is near becomes far. In your life, the things that are closest to you, eventually they move away from you. A childhood friend, your first job, your first love affair, your first wife, if you get married more than once. So many things will move away from you. In this verse, Goethe refers not only to the sunset, which is what he's watching. After a while, the sun goes down and it's gone, but also to life. Everything in life goes through a cycle. It is born, rises up, peaks, and then goes down. All things leave us. And then Borges says, in my case, the visible world left. At 55 years old, he started losing his eyesight, and he completely lost it. It moved away from my eyes, he says, surely forever. But fortunately, it has been replaced by many things. My duty is to accept, and as far as possible, to enjoy those things. I still continue pretending that I am not blind. I still buy books. I still go on filling my house with books. So he, although he's blind, is making a good use of it. He treats it as a resource, and he's not complaining about it. Then Alefano goes on, because Borges is talking about books. He says, there's a theme I would like us to speak about, the theme of books. So Borges says, well, last night, in fact, I had a very strange dream. I dreamed of the burning of a great library, which I believe may have been the Library of Alexandria, with its countless volumes attacked by the flames. So he's talking about this incredible library. This had most of the books of the world, but when the pagans overthrew the people at that time, they burned all the books because they didn't want to be controlled by the past. They wanted things to go into the new. But they burned a lot of precious volumes. And now Borges is asking Alefano, do you believe this dream may have some meaning? So Alefano says, perhaps, Borges. Could it be that you owe your readers a book on the history of the book? Have you ever thought about writing such a book? Because books are so profound and so helpful, it might be nice to write a story about what books are all about. So, Alefano says, have you ever thought of writing such a book? And Borges says, he's 83 years old now. He goes, dear me, no, but it is an excellent idea. It would be wonderful to write a history of book. It'll keep my mind. I'll keep it in mind. Although I don't know if an 83-year-old man can set such a project for himself. However, now I remember, Borges was very well read, that Spengler, in his book The Decline of the West, predates my attempt, for in it he writes remarkable comments on books. Alefano goes further. He goes, in one of your essays, you quote the words of Bernard Shaw. And the quote is, every book worth being reread has been written by the Spirit. So many books, the Bible and spiritual books, of course, have been read and reread and are written by the Spirit. But all books, they all have a positive meaning. And Borges wants to explain why these books are important. So he answers the question of Alefano. He goes, yes, I completely concur with that notion, since a book goes beyond the author's intention. The author's intention is a meager thing. Meager means small thing. A fallible thing. A thing that's not infallible. It's not good forever. It's a passing thought sometimes. The author's intention is a fallible thing. In a book, in every book, there is a need for something more, which is always mysterious. When we read an ancient book, it is as though we are reading all the time that has passed from the day it was written to our present day. A book can be full of errors. We can reject the author's opinions, disagree with him or her, but the book always retains something sacred, something mortal, something magical, which brings happiness. And that's why people read books. The books expand your ideas. They give you a new concept. They fill in the history from when the book was written until now. It's a magical, mysterious, beautiful thing that brings happiness. Why do people read books? It makes them happy. So then Alefano goes on further. He's covered books, but now he wants to get into poetry, okay? Because poetry is very beautiful and esoteric. So Alefano says, Borges, what is poetry? How would you define it? So he asks a very tough question. And Borges is up to it, though. He says, I believe that poetry is something so intimate, so essential, that it cannot be defined without oversimplifying it. So he says, you can't put poetry in a box. Not possible. It would be like attempting to define the color yellow, love, and the leaves of the fall of leaves in the autumn. I believe that poetry is the aesthetic act, and that poetry is not the poem. For the poem may be nothing more than a series of symbols. Then he goes further. Poetry, I believe, is the poetic act that takes place when the poet writes it, when the reader reads it, and it as always happens in a slightly different manner. When the poetic act takes place, it seems to me that we become aware of it. And then he goes further. He goes, poetry is a magical, mysterious, and unexplainable, although not incomprehensible event. If one doesn't feel the poetic event upon reading it, the poet has failed. So you can see he takes a complex subject like poetry and tries to give us different facets of it. He admits that it's hard to be defined and we don't want to oversimplify it. He said it's big, like the subject of love, or trying to explain the color of yellow, or capture the feeling of the leaves falling in the fall when the changes of seasons take place. He says it's magical. Everybody loves magical things. Mysterious. Nobody can pin it down. And unexplainable. So we can't make it mundane and say this is poetry. But it is not incomprehensible. Incomprehensible means we can understand it. Every time we read a good poem, okay, it comes across to us. And sometimes in a different way. When we go back to poetry we've read before, it'll have a new meaning for us and get us to be more inside ourselves and to be more contemplative about our life. So Alefano goes on. He's got a good subject here. He wants to keep going. Borges, what is important in the art of poetry is finding the precise words. Because Alefano has written poetry, and he's read a lot of Borges's poetry and much of the poetry, but he's always the right words. He thinks that the right words, the precise words that would give the poem its power. And he wants to know what Borges thinks about it. And Borges says, to a great extent, those precise words are what elicit the emotion. In other words, the words will bring out the emotion, the right words. I always remember that wonderful line in a poem by Emily Dickinson, who was a great poet, which exemplify this. And he quoted Emily Dickinson, this quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies, end of the quote. So he's looking at the earth around him, and all the dust that's there used to be a man or a woman, okay? But she says, gentlemen and ladies. The ideal is banal. Banal is a lower idea. The idea of dust, the dust of death, we will all be dust one day, is a cliche. We all say it. But what surprises in the phrase gentlemen and ladies is which gives the poetic and magical quality. If she had written men and women are the dust, okay, it would have failed as poetry. It would have been trivial. But finding the precise words, she wrote, this quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies. Alefano, he keeps going. He wants to get more out of Borges. He says, "You have said that metaphors exist from our very beginnings. Could you expound on that concept, Borges?" So Borges says, "Yes, certainly. I believe that metaphors, if they are truly metaphors, exist from the beginning of time. But we express them differently. I have occasionally thought of reducing all metaphors to 5 or 6, which seem to me to be the essential metaphors." So Alefano says, okay, you say 5 or 6 metaphors. What are these fantastic metaphors? Because Alefano's used many metaphors, and so do all poets and literature people. They use these metaphors. And he wants to know, what are these great metaphors? So Borges says, well, time and a river, life and dreams, death and sleep, stars and eyes, flowers and women. These would, I believe, these are the essential metaphors that are found in literatures. And then there are others that are whimsical. Whimsical means fanciful, playful. I believe that the poet's task is to discover metaphors, even though they may already exist. So Borges is saying that death is a metaphor. And even Shakespeare agrees with that. He goes, in the Hamlet, he goes, sleep of death. When somebody dies, they're in the sleep of death. And we've all heard when people come to a grave that the person is dead and they're pushing up daisies. Another metaphor. Or sleeping with the fishes. They've gone to sleep in the ocean with the fishes. Of course, they are dead. Or, there's another word, use cashed in. People that gamble, that go to casinos, say he cashed in his chips. Or he kicked the bucket. So many nice metaphors are there for death. Then he goes further and he talks about the eyes. The eyes are used in many poems and much literature to represent the mirrors of the soul. Windows that you can see the world through. And your eyes light up. And if the eyes are not happy, they're sad, they could look like bullet holes. The eyes are compared to bullet holes in the snow. The sun and the moon are looking at us. They're the eyes of heaven looking at us. And cameras with lenses are also compared to the eyes. And then beautiful poetry, you shine through my eyes. Eyes have a magical quality about them. And then tears and rain, the teardrops that come from our eyes. And then, of course, Borges says the stars are the highest manifestations of eyes. The stars are like eyes looking at us. And then he goes on to flowers and women. And flowers, the metaphors, real flowers, like roses, can be light and dark. There's red roses, light red roses, dark red roses. And then there's even the metaphor of the lotus flower, which represents the country of India. India is a unfolding with the beautiful petals of the lotus, unfolds its history and its beauty of God and the expansion of the soul represented by these leaves that are unfolding. Pure beauty is represented by flowers and women. And it ends with a spiritual purpose, the promise. As God is before the creation, and God is before all things, flowers start off before the fruit. When you see a tree, the flowers will come before the fruit comes. And the sound comes before the tune. You'll always have the flowers first. And then the highest, Borges regards, is women. They are the highest form of flower created by God. So Alefano goes on after that, and he says, Borges, There are people who speak of the disappearance of books. He's trying to take the other side of the argument now. And they assert that modern developments in communication will replace them with something more dynamic and that will require less time than reading. What do you think of that? So Boris considers for a moment, and then he says, I believe that books will never disappear. It is impossible that that would happen. Among the many inventions of man, the book, without a doubt, is the most astounding. All the others are extensions of our bodies. The telephone, for example, is an extension of our voice. The telescope and the microscope are extensions of our sight. The sword and the plow are extensions of our arms. Only the book is an extension of our imagination and our memories. So Alefano goes on and he says, well, you state in a memorable passage that literature is a dream. So he's trying to nail Borges down. What does he mean by this, that literature is a dream? And Borges says, it is true. Literature is a dream, a controlled dream. Now I believe that we owe literature almost everything we are and what we have been. Also, what we will be. Our past is nothing but a sequence of dreams. What difference can there be between dreaming and remembering the past? And we know all great spiritual leaders and realized souls have said this. They've said that life is a longer dream, that the life that we're living every day is a longer dream compared to our dreams that we have at night. But there is no real difference between the two. Our minds are creating both of them. Books are the great memory of all centuries. Their functions are therefore irreplaceable. How could we remember about the past centuries and past heroes and past manifestations of the Godhead unless we had books? If books disappear, then surely history would disappear, and surely man would disappear. So he has a very powerful, dynamic expression about the written word and books. And then you can read here that all of this interview comes from excerpts in 24 conversations with Borges. Okay? Interviews by Roberto Alefano. And what Alefano did, he took the best interviews and he gave it to us in a nutshell. And he ends up by saying, God speaks through these words, and then the creation starts. Once the creation starts, then the creation grows up, and then we can realize that God is the creator and have a relationship with God. Now I'd like to tell you more about this translator, Robert Alefano. He was a poet and a storyteller and an essayist and a journalist, born in the city of General Pinto, it's a province of Buenos Aires, in 1943. And he's still alive. His books have been translated into several languages. And he's known Borges for over 40 years. And he was in love. He just loved to be with Borges because Borges knew about God. He knew about spiritual truth. He knew so much. And he was such a good poet. In fact, from 1974, this is after Borges had become blind, to 1985, he worked with Jorge Luis Borges to make new books and to do new things and to generally help out Borges, who couldn't do everything for himself because he was in a blind state. But Alefano grew a lot during this time period. So at this point, I'd like to go through the glossary that we have with this interview. And the first one is Donna. We've discussed this before, but I want you to remember this, that it's a courtesy title used before the name of a woman in Spanish-speaking countries. Donna, D-O-N-A. And whimsical is a great word. This is fanciful. Some of these metaphors are very whimsical. They get you to be light and loving and fun. And that's what whimsical means. It's a whim. Odyssey. This is a very long Greek epic written by Homer. Explains a lot about life. Library of Alexandria. One of the largest libraries of the ancient world, which was burnt down by the pagans. And then Spengler, another author. He was a German historian and a philosopher who lived from 1980 until 1936. At this point, I'd like to go through the questions that are asked about this beautiful interview. And the first question I want you to resolve and answer is, how, according to Borges, does the book go beyond the author's intention? I'd like you to explain what he says about this, that all books retain something sacred, something magical, something which brings happiness. So in your own words, write a beautiful paragraph or two as how the book goes beyond the author's intention. Next, on comprehension number 2, why does Borges feel remorseful after his mother's death regarding his relationship with her? As you remember, he felt a little sad that it didn't bring her more happiness. Can this experience be generalized? And then he goes further, and he says all people, after their mothers died particularly, feel a little remorse that they weren't kinder and nicer to her. This is a chance to reflect on your relationship with your mother. The next question that this interview brings up is, how does Borges elaborate on Goethe's words, all that is near becomes far? This is a beautiful thought for contemplation. Everything that is the nearest to us. When we're a child, we have our favorite toy. But when we grow up and get married, where is that toy? It becomes far. Look at our health. Look at our eyesight. Boy, we can see fantastic. Then when we get older, sometimes we need glasses. Sometimes we go blind. Sometimes we can't see at all. Everything that is near to us, eventually, with time, can become far from us. And that's what this question is allowing you to contemplate on and to write. The next question is, what, according to Borges, should one think of humiliations and misfortunes? This is one of the major themes of this interview, is no matter what you get, you should look at it as a gift from God, as a gift from destiny, so that you, especially being an artist or an artful person, can do something creative with it, something to inspire other people that will have the same problem, and can be used as a song or a story later on that will bring much happiness to people. And then there's discuss Borges' views on poetry and the poem. In that one long paragraph that we discussed, he has these beautiful ideas. Poetry is indefinable and irreplaceable and magical and can't be described like the color yellow or love. So write a paragraph or two about this and what his ideas about poetry are and what your ideas of poetry are. And then he goes further on poetry and he says, why is it important for poetry to use language? Precisely. What examples does Borges use to demonstrate this aspect of poetic language? Do you remember that he said from Emily Dickinson that gentlemen and ladies make up this dust, okay? This quiet dust was gentlemen and ladies. That's the point he brings up. But it's the precise word of gentlemen and ladies, okay, that make it poetic. So precise words are very important in poetry to bring your mind into it and to give you all of these beautiful thoughts. And then he finishes up here and he says, in spite of modern modes of communication, Borges feels that books will not disappear. And why does he say that? And then we get into the heavy ideas of fact that God creates the world with his voice and with his words. And these authors from poems and literature, they create magical books and bring you to faraway islands and to faraway ideas through the word. The word is very creative. And then the last point I'd like to discuss are word pairs. This is the part of English literature that is beautiful. In English literature, there are certain pairs of words that always go together. They appear in the same order, like back and forth. It would sound awkward if we read forth and back. Here is a list of some of the common word pairs, and we've all heard of these: trial and error. We try something, we see the error, and then we know something won't work. So by trial and error, we know the right thing to do. Null and void. You write a bad paper, you cross through it, it's null and void. You're not going to hand this paper into your English teacher. Flora and fauna. Flora represents all of the plants, and the fauna is all the animals. Big part of creation. Whims and fancies. What are whims? They're ideas. We just get this idea, and we have a fancy to do something. So they'll use this in literature. This person had many whims and fancies. High and dry. In any rainstorm, what do we try to do? We try to find a place that's high and dry. Time and again. We try to do something one time, and then we do it again. Pick and choose. We go to the store, we pick out a couple of shirts, and then we have to choose which is the best shirt. So we pick and choose. Time and tide. The time goes on and then the tide goes out. The tide comes in. Time and tide. We watch how this time and tide comes in and out of our lives. When we get in a fight or we see a dog fight, what is it? They're fighting tooth and nail. They're biting with their teeth. They're scratching with their nails. When you really get in a fight and you're 100% into it, tooth and nail, you're involved in this fight or this operation. Forgive and forget. This is a beautiful word pair. If we really forgive somebody, what do we have to do? We have to forget it. If we haven't forgotten it, have we really forgiven the person? You say, well, I forgive you now, but I'm not going to forget it. It's not really forgiveness. So forgive and forget. Pros and cons. Pros are positive things about people. Cons are negative things. So whenever we discuss a subject, we give the pros and the cons for a subject. Anyway, there's many more fun ones in the English language. Rock and roll. Everybody loves that. You know, you sing certain songs, they're rock and roll songs. You don't say roll and rock, you say rock and roll. Salt and pepper. You set the table, you don't put pepper here and salt there, you put salt and pepper on the table. So we learned a lot from this interview, and this interview has shown us that we are going towards the Godhead to find out what life is really about. And we want to know what it lasts a long time, and we want to bring that into our lives. Thank you for your kind attention. Om Sai Ram.